So I have the pleasure of introducing Dr. Ruzycki and Dr. Bharwani to discuss gender equity in the Department of Medicine. So Dr. Bharwani is the Director for Public Policy and Strategic Partnerships with the Cummings School of Medicine and the Lead for Public Policy at the O'Brien Institute for Public Health. And he is also a general internist who works on the medical teaching unit. Dr. Ruzycki is also a general internist and a clinical assistant professor in the Departments of Medicine and Community Health Science, and a lead on quality improvement and diversity and equity. So they're going to be sharing their research today and an overview of gender equity in the Department of Medicine. And just before they start, for the physicians on the line, if I could just give a small plug to the physician diversity survey, which everyone should have received the link for. It takes about 10 to 15 minutes to fill in. And the information provided in that survey is going to be really important in defining resources for research and education moving forward. So if everybody could take the time to fill that out, that would be great. So I'll hand it over to Dr. Bharwani and Dr. Ruzycki.
Thank you. So we are Aleem Bharwani and Shannon Ruzycki. About 3 years ago now, Richard Lee appointed me Vice Chair Strategy for the Department of Medicine. And our first strategic action was to better understand issues around gender equity. So I selected Dr. Ruzycki as my co-chair, and we assembled a task force comprising internal and external experts. And that resulted in a final report that's available to you, and we will circulate that by email today after the talk. We're grateful to the combined AHS and UCalgary leadership for having the wisdom and maturity to not sweep this under the rug, to appropriately resource the task, and to stay the course even when things became uncomfortable, and they did become uncomfortable.
We just want to note that our methods only captured binary gender data. We did not intentionally explore intersectionality in these methods. Our presentation is copyright compliant, and we aim to use person first and inclusive language throughout, but we can always improve. So if you see or hear anything exclusive, please send one of us an email and we'll change it. We would like to take this opportunity to acknowledge the traditional territories of Treaty 7 region in southern Alberta. The city of Calgary is also home to the Métis Nation of Alberta, Region 3.
Today, I will cover our guiding principles. Shannon will highlight the literature. Then we will outline results and introduce interventions. What does it mean to be a citizen? We're citizens of our city, our province and country, but also of sections and clinical units. We're citizens in all these places because we inhabit these areas where our fates are intertwined. We influence what happens in these areas, and we're influenced by what happens in these areas. This influence comes with responsibility. No matter if that contact is fleeting or continuous, inadvertent or regretful, responsibility transgresses intention. The law holds us accountable. The Alberta Human Rights Act is the enforceable legal standard. Assault is assault is assault. Discrimination is discrimination is discrimination, regardless of intention. The law is our absolute minimum standard. In society, the law represents the lowest common denominator among a cosmopolitan set of values. However, in a department, we are not bound to the lowest common denominator. We are not bound to be merely non-criminal. We aspire to more. We set our standards and norms, representing our expectations and responsibilities to one another that exceed the minimum standard of the law. Standards of justice and fairness, which differentiate equality, parity, and equity. Equality implies everyone should be treated the same, regardless of context. In contrast, equity recognizes biologic and social differences between genders. The goal of equity is not sameness, but fairness, fostering equal access to opportunity despite differences. So numerical parity, or an exact numerical distribution of men and women in leadership positions, is not the goal of equity, because it doesn't take into account the path. That there are men and women in the department is a sociological fact. This has been the case for decades. This form of diversity is not new, and neither are the unique characteristics that distinguish men and women. The potential to bear children is uniquely female, an anatomic difference. Exclusive biology does not necessitate exclusion. We do not live in isolation. We marinate in broad societal gender norms. Society expects women to carry disproportionately more household and caregiving roles. Women physicians, on average, have the equivalent of an additional job compared to men physicians. These biologic and social differences change the path women travel. If one group has to work harder than the other to achieve the same outcome, that is not equity.
I'm going to provide a short summary of the different types of disparities that are documented in medicine, starting with harassment and discrimination. There has been nearly 2 decades of peer-reviewed literature documenting unacceptably high rates of harassment and discrimination that often involves residents and medical students. This literature covers a broad range of specialties, career stages, countries, and practice settings. Women are uniformly overrepresented among physicians reporting harassment and discrimination. Similarly, disparities between women and men physicians have been demonstrated in multiple facets of leadership and academic attainment across medicine in multiple countries across decades. A compensation gap that favors men physicians has been found in a variety of specialties, practice settings, and countries. This gap has been demonstrated in Canada and at the University of Calgary. This gap persists after adjustment for years of practice, specialty, hours worked, patients seen, years of experience, number of publications, and number of parental leaves. Documentation of inequity between men and women physicians has moved beyond peer review literature. These examples from Canada news media demonstrate the growing awareness among our patients about inequities. Overall, peer-reviewed evidence demonstrates persistent disparities between men and women physicians that consistently disadvantage women physicians in multiple domains over decades. Based on this data, our objective was to assess how disparities and inequities are experienced or perceived in our Department of Medicine. To do this, we used a mixed method study design. We started with a quantitative survey of all members of the Department of Medicine about the culture towards women. We followed up with qualitative interviews with all Department of Medicine members who volunteered. We asked them about their experiences of gender in the Department of Medicine and their advice on interventions to reduce these inequities. For the quantitative phase, we used a tool called the Culture Conducive to Women's Academic Success, or the CCWAS. This is an instrument that correlates to better work-life balance for women physicians. Items are scored on a 5-point Likert scale, and higher scores suggest a more equitable culture for women. There are 4 domains. They are equal access, chair support, freedom from gender bias, and support for work-life balance. In our department, we had an overall response rate of 37%, but women had double the response rate of men. The domain of equal access had items such as women faculty are more likely to have others take credit for their work. Domain of chair support had items like, my division head ensures that women faculty are included in informal division gatherings. The domain of gender bias included questions like, women are encouraged to raise concerns about bias against women, even if those biases are subtle. And in the domain of work-life balance, women who reduce their workload are viewed by their colleagues as less committed to their careers. Higher scores represent a more equitable culture. We found that men and women experience the culture of the Department of Medicine differently, where women rated the culture lower towards women than men. And of note, the lowest score by a man in the Department of Medicine was still greater than the 25th centile of women's scores. The 25th centile of women's scores, indicating that men who felt the Department of Medicine was the least equitable for women still rated the department as better than 25% of the women respondents. When we separated this out by years of experience, we found that men with the highest levels of experience in our department rated the culture towards women as the most equitable compared to other groups. The qualitative phase was open-ended interview questions about the experiences and perceptions of gender equity in the Department of Medicine. They were held by an external interviewer, and we took all volunteers. We didn't rely on saturation of themes. We interviewed over 7% of our department, but again, women had a higher response rate than the men. We identified two themes mediated by two experiences. Found parent and caregiving and leadership culture were mediated by the experiences of harassment and discrimination and exclusion. We will now read quotes illustrated of each of these themes. The quotes have been anonymized and de-identified.
Did you know a substantial proportion of female physicians have faced infertility or have regrets about family planning decisions and career decision making?
I came back to work after 6 months, and I had a really hard time trying to find somewhere to breast pump. I was pumping in random clinic spaces. I would just find random people's offices to pump in. It's difficult to continue to breastfeed in medicine because you're away from your child for so long. There's just so many little things that add up to make my life more difficult.
For me, this issue of breastfeeding was particularly jarring. Women end up pumping milk because women in medicine typically return to work early after delivery in order to fulfill clinical, academic, or collegial obligations. But pumping milk requires you to pump every 3 to 4 hours for 15 to 45 minutes each time. Now, some say if it gets busy, it's okay, just skip one, but you can't just skip one. You have to maintain that schedule to maintain supply. So now, once you pump milk, there are no AHS spaces in which to store breast milk. And we have heard multiple stories of nursing staff throwing away breast milk because it's considered a biohazard, a bodily fluid. This is food a mother made for her baby who requires that food. So women are running back and forth between the wards and clinics, risking exposure and hygiene gaps in random semi-public office spaces to maintain supply for their child. Especially in residency, but even for staff, you have little or no control over patient numbers or cadence of clinic visits. This illustrates intrinsic differences in biology create unique equity gaps, compounded by structural issues from refrigeration to accessible private spaces, resulting in unique challenges that are only faced by women. This is not a new challenge. Breastfeeding is not a fad. Most of us who have not pumped milk don't actually know any of this. And we suspect many who should know, section chiefs, site chiefs, program directors, have either not thought about it or didn't know they could or should ask. And the purpose of today's talk is to open the lines of curiosity and humility. It is not only okay to ask, it is expected of us. I was going to a research meeting, which was mandatory for me to maintain my funding. I was on mat leave and I had to bring my baby to the meeting. I just nursed her in the back, but was told afterwards that if I was going to bring a baby, and particularly if I was going to be breastfeeding, I was not welcome at those meetings. I had to either come without my child, who was very young, or just not come and not get funded.
We need to re-examine our assumptions about so-called professionalism and ask ourselves how or why, if we need to draw a hard line on these types of issues. It is difficult to find temporary childcare, especially for babies under 3 months. Not allowing accommodations or flexibility at meetings or in other situations restricts the ability of women physicians to participate. I had a male colleague come to me and say, "We have had all these meetings, why couldn't you come? It shows you don't care about your career." You know how hard it is to get to these meetings at 7 in the morning with kids at a young age?
Women want to participate fully in the workforce, but also have unique parenthood and caregiving responsibilities. And we know from the literature that household and caregiving roles fall disproportionately on the woman. This constant stress of feeling inadequate at home, then inadequate at work, becomes toxic. It's the kind of unhealthy stress that you don't sleep off on a holiday, that doesn't pass with a deadline or get rewarded with a grant, but that slowly fatigues and exasperates you.
This quote also emphasizes that men in our department may not understand the unique challenges experienced by their women colleagues. While this man was attempting to provide helpful advice about career advancement, he did not ask or inquire about her situation and did not consider that she may have had other responsibilities. Due to these assumptions, the advice was unhelpful.
Did you know, while men and women report similar levels of distress in response to social exclusion, when exclusion is gender-oriented, females report more distress than males, and that distress felt by females has been found to be comparable to physical pain.
There's a lot of mentorship that happens behind the scenes. If you're not even being invited to the golf course, you just lost potentially a massive opportunity for some mentorship or career advancement.
You attend conferences together, but again, you're not part of the group. You make no connections. I mean, it's a wonder I got a job.
The Department of Medicine is known for its collegiality and the friendships that form among faculty and among residents. We do not seek to police these friendships, and in fact, they are something that we're proud of.
But we do know that friendships form along lines of similarity, similar interests, similar backgrounds, similar ethnicity, etc. And we know social exclusion is not always intentional, but we need to be mindful how certain social invitations and friendships might exclude certain groups of people. We need to be thoughtful how to create opportunities for everyone. That doesn't mean you go to hockey games, that you don't curl. It just means as a leader, program director, site chief, you need to make sure these quasi-departmental social activities are of sufficient variety that everyone can participate somewhere. Remember, you, especially in the setting of trainees, have their careers in your hands.
Did you know that 74% of AHS leadership is male?
I look at my male colleagues who are very confident and very accomplished. They're doing great things because they've been given the support to achieve whatever they want to achieve. It would be great for females to be able to achieve what they want with complete support. Instead, I see women giving up the fight because it's too exhausting.
We found that the barriers are so numerous and so small that women couldn't explicitly name them, but they recognized that there was something different about their experiences compared to their men peers.
There have been times where I sought support from male leaders in situations where I felt like I was disadvantaged because of my gender. I think I put some of my male leaders in a very, very uncomfortable position. I know that they wanted to help, but they just didn't know what they could do.
And even when the women in our department sought help from leadership, their leaders did not know how to address these barriers, sometimes invisible. When reading the examples, Aleem and I were struck with how diffuse and challenging these instances of bias or discrimination were to name and address. Bias, exclusion, and discrimination are difficult to see in individual interactions, but have large effects on groups of people. It can be invalidating as an individual in a group to not know that your experience is real or meaningful. One of our main objectives of today's talk is to bear witness to these experiences. We are working for our CV, not working for ourselves. We're not working for something bigger or greater.
Women shared a profound frustration and fatigue with command and control leadership styles, instead preferring consensus-oriented, collaborative, and service-focused styles. I suspect what we're hearing here is a minority group, women department members, feel misunderstood. And when they try to be heard, they feel either isolated or not heard, and at times even combated. We recognize the thankless job of many leadership roles, where the workload far exceeds the FTE allocation. And we get that metrics of performance don't reward consensual, collaborative behaviors, empathy, humility, respect for difference. In fact, they're dismissed as soft skills or CanMed stuff. Yet these soft skills are the very leadership traits that could have protected us from long-standing gender inequity.
Did you know that 30 to 60% of trainees report harassment, but 98% of those who report are women?
In many examples we are citing today, there is a gap between perception and experience. And we've attempted to explore different perspectives while synthesizing these quotes. However, what follows is a series of egregious examples that do not require discussion. These examples are only a small sample from among pages of examples we heard. To protect participant identities, we cannot share the most vile examples. And of those we are presenting, we have watered down details to reduce risk of attribution. So not only did we not cherry pick these examples, in fact, the most salacious examples do not appear. The following examples are inappropriate, contemporary, and some, depending on context, possibly violate the Alberta Human Rights Act, exposing both the individual and the organization to liability.
Another male specialist in my division said, "I'm fine if women want to try and do this job, but for God's sakes, please buy a bit of lipstick or put on a dress.
During a recent discussion with a mentor about a potential project, he mentioned to me that instead of focusing on taking on another project, I should focus on having this baby and being present for my family. It was a bit shocking. It really came out of nowhere. I was like, wow, this is overt sexism. I was not being looked at as an academic. I was being looked at as a woman.
When I announced my second pregnancy, I got comments from colleagues like, again, or really? Because we just had to get coverage for your first mat leave, and now we have to get coverage again.
An email that was sent to our division said, our call schedule for the next year has been set, and we have just enough people to work as long as no one gets sick or no one has a baby.
During my hiring, there was a man on the committee, and he said I wasn't ready for the job. They ended up offering me a modified job, and the reason they gave me was, we don't want you to be burnt out, given that you're a mom.
At a meeting to discuss hiring another specialist into our group, a man said, I don't think we should hire any more women. They have two jobs, doctor and mom.
When speaking about a female that was being recruited to our division, a male colleague said, we don't expect her to be here long. She's 40 and single.
I was chosen to give a presentation at a big international conference when I was a fellow, and my program director at the time told me I would do a great job because I was a young and beautiful female.
A preceptor here who's very well respected said, the only way you're going to get a job is if you work like a man. And I looked at him and I said, I don't know what that means because my whole life I've worked hard.
One of my colleagues said, I can't work with that doctor because she's a Middle Eastern derogatory term. I stopped and said, you can't say that. That's so unacceptable. He was pissed right off that I called him on that. We heard a mismatch between the experiences expressed by women and the perceptions by men about these experiences. This mismatch seems to fall into two categories, ignorance and complacency.
I would say this Department of Medicine is doing stalwart work at achieving gender equity. At my hospital, we have a 50-50 split in terms of the physicians who are present.
Numerical parity is an outcome, but it does not capture the path to that outcome. Numerical parity is not equity. While this might be better than some other centers or institutions, it doesn't mean we stop there. Good enough is simply not good enough. If you asked somebody, have you got proof that gender inequity is happening? The answer would likely be no. Looking at gender equity issues, there's always that gender card that people can play, just like the racist card that people can play, or whatever card you want to play, if it suits their needs. So it's always a fine balance.
We heard the concern that if we reduce inequities or barriers for one group, that will result in this group being taken advantage of at expense of the first group. This is the concern of the pendulum swinging too far, meaning that if we reduce inequities for women physicians, men physicians will be at a disadvantage. This is why we are committed to an ongoing discussion and monitoring for the unintended consequences and the creation of new inequity with our initiatives. However, the potential for unintended consequences is not a reason to allow barriers, discrimination, and disparities to persist. These articles are published because somebody found something. What about the articles that were never written by people who have not found inequity? Because most people wouldn't read those. They'll read this and say, oh, we've got to do something about this. But there's a limit to what's in the literature. There's publication bias.
Yes, gender equity is a difficult area to study. There are no RCTs. It's a different form of data. But let's not raise the burden of proof to unattainable standards. Ask yourself, what is an acceptable amount of illegal activity? How much sexual harassment is okay? I've been to division meetings where crazy stuff is said, so sexist. Our division head doesn't say anything. Most men have very poor insight that they're being sexist.
We heard of a natural tendency to avoid conflict by our leaders, but when this comes from leaders ignoring discrimination or bias, it sends a message that behavior is acceptable. Those who are target feel less safe and less supported. When you don't sit down with people on a day-to-day basis, you have no idea what they're thinking, and you don't know what's going on within the division, so it's very hard to say if we have gender equity.
We are the standard we walk by. Those before us had an excuse that they didn't know. But after today's presentation and report, now we know. So what standard do we want to set? What standard are you now willing to walk by? If you leave this Zoom room and your standard has not changed, then we have failed. Complacent is complicit. Perceptions arise from what we see, how we reflect on our world, and our own sense of right, much of which is guided by our own experiences, our own histories, each situated in very different contexts. People are not bad people. What we do have is an empathy gap. Empathy is not sympathy. Nobody interviewed wanted sympathy. Empathy is joining another in the human experience, sharing euphoria, joy, remorse, sadness, curiosity, frustration. Empathy is a co-experience, but such co-experiences are difficult in the context of tremendous background noise, heavy call, rising patient loads, growing patient complexity, endless personal demands. So we need systems in place that cut through that noise, policies and procedures that help us listen and understand to create equal access to opportunity. Improving gender equity will, in fact, rise all boats. To interrupt bias, we encourage mandating respect and implicit bias programs and the blinding of applications where possible. To encourage dialogue, we take two approaches. For dissimilar groups, we want members to share experiences, challenges, and opportunities to ally. For similar groups, we want members to help one another to support each other through networking, mentorship, or sponsorship. Departmental leadership is required because there are things that only a department can do, things that cannot be further delegated. These include a knowledge management strategy on equity, digitally accessible rounds, and a parenthood policy. Last, this is all fluff without accountability. We have recommended the implementation and development of a range of assessment and evaluation tools, ranging from equity-oriented 360s to concrete reporting mechanisms and severity scales for harassment and discrimination, as well as a code of conduct to remove gray areas around what is a shifting line. These suggestions are at the level of the department. This is a word cloud of our report. The report will be sent to you after rounds via link.
I just want to take a second to talk about the physician diversity census that some of you have already completed, and I'm hopeful that all of you will take a look at if you haven't, and you'll be receiving an email about this after the presentation. The diversity census is for all physicians in Alberta. We're attempting to answer 3 questions. The first is, who works here as a physician in Alberta in terms of diversity? We have no reliable data on the diversity of Albertan physicians. The second question is, where do these people work? Is there differences in terms of leadership, academic attainment, and decision-making in diversity? And do physicians from different backgrounds experience medical culture differently, specifically in terms of harassment, discrimination, and bias? So by participating in the survey, you can help us understand these 3 questions. Thank you for considering. Please email us if you have any questions or comments, but we can take questions now as well.
Well, thanks. That was great. That was great. I don't know if there's any questions. I haven't seen any questions on the chat thing here. I was going to ask you that one of the things that I noticed is that only 37% of all the members of the Department of Medicine actually responded to this survey. So how do we increase that? What does this mean that, you know, less than half actually responded? Other people are not interested in this, or you don't have the time? What's going on there?
Yeah, it was really interesting. We saw that more than half of the women in the department responded to the survey, and then about a quarter of the men in the department responded to the survey. We thought a lot about the reasons for that. Is it because that men saw a survey about gender equity and thought, this isn't a time for me to speak up? Or is it that they didn't feel engaged? We know response rates for surveys in Alberta are usually, among physicians, are usually less than 20%. And it's a good question on how to raise that engagement and response rate into these topics. I think people are very cynical sometimes about whether or not participation will, how it will affect them and how it will matter for them. So I'm hopeful that you guys will respond to my diversity survey.
Yeah, you bet.
And I think surveys are interesting, right? They're done as part of a study in this scenario in order to better understand the lay of the land. But that's not the only engagement that occurs, right? I mean, during this process, I think Shannon and I, this became like a massive topic of conversation everywhere we went, anywhere in the hospital. So you constantly engaging people, even when they're not filling out surveys. So yes, as part of the research, those answers don't populate. But as part of a broader engagement strategy, which is just really living our lives and engaging people, listening and understanding conditions. I think that engagement's probably a little bit higher, but again, it's still even compared, as Shannon said, compared to baseline, traditional rates of response, it actually was quite good.
So hey, it's Vikas. That was a great talk. I've got just two kind of specific questions. The first one, I'm not as familiar with the literature, but certainly, a lot of people talk about taking the implicit bias test. You guys have mentioned that. You can do it on the Harvard website. Do you know if you take the implicit bias test and you're aware of your implicit bias, does that change your implicit bias, or do you get better at hiding your explicit bias?
So the link between, oh, sorry, are you done your question? I was so excited.
I got a second question, but I'll do the first one. You can do the first one.
Okay. Implicit bias is something we all have, and it's a product of where we were raised, what we watched on TV, our parents' attitudes, what we learned in school. And so your implicit bias, it gives you a measure of how you may have these attitudes that you're not aware of. And often those attitudes are in conflict with your personally stated values. Or your explicit biases or your unintended actions. So for example, if you have high implicit bias against women, which we can be raised to have that, you may unintentionally rate female applicants lower than male applicants without even meaning to. When we're aware of those biases, we can check our actions and say, am I being biased? What is the objective data here when I'm making my decisions? Or it can help you create systems where implicit bias has less impact on your behaviors, like masking the names of your applicants, for example. So having high implicit bias is supposed to make you feel more aware so that you can reflect on how you're making your decisions, rather than, as a judgment of the quality of yourself as a person or whether you're a good or bad person.
Okay.
Sorry, if I just quickly, yeah. I think the public health comparison is good, right? Because if there are certain degrees of bias present in aggregate across a large group of people, the system level interventions, the population health level interventions that are going to be productive, and then that's paired with individual actions and individual sort of accountabilities where you're trying to adjust and address and try to be more objective, for example, in the ratings. So instead of if you're going to be commenting on sort of socio-emotional skills, make sure you're also commenting on very concrete skills as well. And so I think there's that balance of the aggregate population health level, so to speak, intervention, and then the individual efforts and behaviors.
Okay. Yeah, that's great. So there's a lot of interest in that, right? Especially now with sort of the police issues, and a lot of the police forces in the US are doing implicit bias testing, and they're looking at experiments where they look at their reaction time when they see suspects of different, color and see how they behave. The second thing was a more specific question. Obviously, you guys have been doing this for a while. You brought up some specific examples. Are there things you've done in your department to sort of changes that you've seen come about? A specific thing would be you brought the breastfeeding issue. And to be honest, something I never even thought of, but it makes perfect sense when you brought it up. So, did you guys act on that? Did you set up something, maybe something we can follow in our own kind of division based on what you guys have done?
The Alberta Health Services has taken on lactation spaces because AHS is responsible for most of our workplaces. So AHS is putting through a lactation space policy. So all workplaces under AHS will have a lactation space. That policy was put through right at the end of February 2020, which I guess was became suddenly a very busy time for some people. So I don't know where it is now, but they voted on it. I was there February 20th. And so I don't know if that got paused for any particular reason. In our department, we developed an inclusive language and images policy for presentations and education in the coming School of Medicine. So what that looks like is, what kind of language do you use to describe people? What kind of images do you use in your slides that are diverse or not diverse? And the Office of Professionalism, Equity, and Diversity has put that through as a formal policy in the Cummings School of Medicine. So everyone should be hearing more about how they need to redesign their presentations and teaching topics to accommodate inclusion and diversity. And we are currently doing a Grand Round series. And I think on September 29th, you guys will be joining us as part of our Grand Round series on equity, diversity, and inclusion. So on September 25th, I think, it's Dr. Stephanie Nixon is going to talk about privilege. So we do that 4 times a year as kind of an education series. And then recently we're starting something called EDI moments, which is at the beginning of our formal leadership meetings. We're going to take 5 minutes and talk about an issue in equity, diversity, inclusion. So these moments are pre-planned, and the goal is to inform people in the department and increase our EDI literacy around specific topics. And so that will be a structured part of formal leadership meetings. And what else are we doing, Aleem? We're doing a lot of things. We're busy.
Yeah, so we're working with AHS to develop equity-oriented leadership evaluations for all leaders within the AHS Calgary zone as a pilot that will then be scaled provincially. There's broader work around different indices that we're sort of in earlier stages of developing. That, I mean, some of these things are, 5-year objectives, but we're just sort of moving them along the way. And then, of course, there's sort of like different dimensions of how you promote empathy. There's the pluralism diagnostic tool. So there's a lot of stuff that's happening. I think there's been a tremendous amount of work in a very short period of time. And I think the gender equity work really did serve as a trampoline for all sorts of equity and inclusion behaviors. I think it allowed us to be better prepared. It allows us to be better prepared for any forms. But I think there's a lot going on. If you look at the report and that link that's sent, that'll be sent at the end of rounds. Towards the end, there's a list of 14 recommendations, and we attach timelines and goals to those. And so if you look at those, you'll be able to see, and I think we're tracking those pretty tightly.
Okay, well, that sounds great. And it sounds like you guys are probably in the forefront in helping AHS with some of this, and I guess it'll trickle down everywhere then. So thank you. Are there any other questions? If people are shy, they could type their questions in too. And I guess if you have questions later, it looks like your emails are on there. They could email you as well. Thank you, Shannon and Aleem. And what stuff are you going to send us after? You're going to send us a link for the survey and the recommendations. Is that right?
Yeah, link to the report. So the actual sort of like summary report it's not the research paper. It's the actual just sort of like summary report where you can sort of read through everything we reported and the recommendations that are involved.
Okay, perfect. Yeah, and if you can send it to Carlos and Karina, they could forward it to all of us. And thank you. And as you know, in our own group, we have Michelle sort of heading this as well. So we'll probably work with you guys as time goes on. Thank you.
Thanks for having me.
Bye. Yeah.
And we'll just loiter here in case anyone has any questions and they want to come to the front afterwards.
There are not very many questions.
Yeah, that's surprising. I think it's also, it's probably gifted time, right? It's like everyone's so busy that if you've got 15 minutes that you can.
It's nice to have extra time.
Yeah.
I'm thrilled to have the extra time.
Hi, this is one of the residents. I just wanted to thank you for the topic because it is a very important topic, though I know it tends to be swept under the rug quite a bit. And if there's anybody who's interested in getting into this sort of research, how would we go about doing that if we're not within the Department of Internal Medicine?
I would recommend reaching out to Michelle Kier from your department. She's actually starting a couple of research projects that I'm sure she would be very helpful, happy to have help on. If you have specific research questions, you can always email me. I'm going on a maternity leave in 4 weeks, but we have lots of extra work that can be done. And then there's a bit of research going on with other people in the department. So if you're interested, just send me an email. I can link you up with some people. Doing a lot of great stuff. We'd love to have you.
Great, thanks so much.
All right. Should we roll?
Yeah, up to you. Up to you guys. There's still 9 people.
I wonder if they left their devices on.
Well, I don't know. I mean, I could go see some patients. I am on MTU. Yeah, we're going to get paged.
Yeah.
My SEM popped up in the middle, but I don't think you guys could see it.
No,
Did you see it?
No.
My SEM popped up. I don't know what happened. It just when it just automatically triggers sometimes and you don't know why. It just popped up with all of my patient names on it. And I was like, oh my God.
Yeah.